They told me I was ungrateful. They said I didn't deserve the roof over my head. They threw my belongings onto the front lawn like I was nothing more than yesterday's trash, all because I refused to hand over my inheritance check on my 22nd birthday. But what they didn't know was that my grandmother had taught me something they never learned. Sometimes the quiet ones are the ones who see everything coming. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning of March 15th started like any other birthday in the Torres household. I woke up in my childhood bedroom in Scottsdale, sunlight streaming through the desert print curtains my mom had hung when I was 12 and never bothered to change. The smell of coffee and bacon drifted up from the kitchen, and for a moment, everything felt normal. 22 years old, fresh out of Arizona State with a communications degree, and finally ready to start my own life. I padded downstairs, in my pajamas, expecting the usual birthday routine. Maybe a homemade card from my little brother Brandon, definitely my dad's famous weekend pancakes, and the comfortable chaos of a family morning. Instead, I found my parents sitting at the kitchen table, looking like they were about to deliver bad news. My mom, Karen, had that tight smile she wore when she was about to ask me for something I wouldn't want to give. My dad, Steve, couldn't even meet my eyes. "Happy birthday, sweetheart," Mom said, but her voice had an edge to it that made my stomach turn. "We need to talk." Brandon was nowhere to be seen, which should have been my first red flag. My 19-year-old brother never missed an opportunity to eat Dad's pancakes, and the kitchen was suspiciously quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator. I poured myself a cup of coffee, noting that they hadn't made extra like they usually did on special occasions. "What's going on?" Dad finally looked up, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Desperation, maybe, or guilt. "Jessica, you know we've been struggling with the shop." Torres Family Auto Repair had been my dad's pride and joy for 15 years. He'd built it from nothing, working 18-hour days to establish a reputation in the competitive Phoenix market. But lately, with the economy and new chain stores moving in, business had been slower than usual. "I know things have been tight," I said carefully, settling into my usual chair. "But you said it was temporary." Mom leaned forward, clasping her hands together. "It's more serious than we let on. We're behind on the mortgage, the shop lease, everything. We've been trying to handle it ourselves, but—" She trailed off, glancing at Dad. "We need help," Dad finished. "And today, you're getting Grandma Rosa's inheritance." My grandmother had passed away 6 months earlier, leaving me a substantial inheritance that had been tied up in probate. Rosa Torres had been a formidable woman who'd immigrated from Mexico with nothing and built a small empire of rental properties throughout Phoenix. She'd always told me that education and independence were the most important things a woman could have, and she'd made sure her will reflected those values. "The inheritance is for my future," I said slowly. Grandma was very specific about that. "Your future won't matter if we lose the house," Mom snapped, her composure cracking. "Do you want to be responsible for your family becoming homeless?" I stared at her, coffee growing cold in my hands. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" Dad pulled out a manila folder and slid it across the table. "We need you to sign over the inheritance to help save the business and the house, just temporarily, until we get back on our feet." I opened the folder and felt my heart sink. These weren't temporary loan papers. These were complete transfer documents that would move every penny of my grandmother's carefully saved money directly into my parents' accounts. No repayment terms, no timeline, no protections for me at all. "This isn't a loan," I said quietly. "This is you asking me to give you everything Grandma left me." "It's family money," Mom said, her voice rising. "It should be used to help the family. Grandma specifically left it to me for college loans and to start my career. She made me promise I'd use it to build something of my own." The kitchen. fell silent except for the tick of the wall clock. I could feel the weight of their expectation pressing down on me, the familiar guilt that came whenever I didn't immediately comply with their wishes. But something about this felt different, wrong. "I need time to think about this," I said finally. Dad's face darkened. "Think about what? Your family is drowning, and you're worried about what a dead woman wanted? Don't talk about Grandma. Like that." The words came out sharper than I intended. Mom stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the tile floor. "You know what, Jessica? I'm tired of this. We've fed you, clothed you, put a roof over your head for 22 years. We paid for your college when we could barely afford it. And now, when we need help, you're being selfish." "I'm not being selfish. I'm trying to honor Grandma's wishes and protect my future." "Your future?" Dad laughed bitterly. "You're living in our house, eating our food, with no job and no prospects. What future are you protecting?" The accusation stung because it held a grain of truth. I'd been back home for 3 months since graduation, sending out resumes and working part-time at the community college while I figured out my next steps. But I'd been contributing to household expenses and helping with Brandon's tuition. I wasn't the deadbeat they were making me out to be. "I've been helping with expenses," I said, "and I have job interviews lined up." "Part-time work at a community college isn't a career," Mom said dismissively. "You're 22 years old. Jessica, it's time to stop playing around and help your family." Brandon appeared in the doorway, probably drawn by the raised voices. He looked uncomfortable, shifting from foot to foot as he took in the tension. "What's going on?" he asked quietly. "Your sister is refusing to help save our home," Mom said without looking at him. "That's not what's happening," I protested. "I just need time to—" "There is no time," Dad interrupted. "The bank wants payment by the end of the week, or we lose everything." I looked at Brandon, hoping for some support, but he just stared at the floor. He'd always been the peacekeeper, in our family, avoiding conflict whenever possible. I couldn't expect him to take sides, especially when his own future hung in the balance. "Fine," I said, standing up. "I'll think about it today and give you an answer tonight." "There's nothing to think about," Mom said coldly. "Either you help your family or you don't. It's that simple." I walked toward the stairs, my birthday morning completely ruined. Behind me, I heard Dad say something about ungrateful children and Mom agreeing with him in rapid Spanish. I'd disappointed them before, but this felt different. This felt final. In my room, I pulled out my laptop and read through my grandmother's will again. The language was clear and specific. The inheritance was meant to give me independence and opportunities she'd never had. She'd made me promise, the last time I saw her in the hospital, that I wouldn't let anyone pressure me into giving it up. "Mija," she'd whispered, her voice weak but determined. "Family is important, but sometimes family will try to clip your wings to keep you close. Don't let them. Fly." I spent the rest of the morning researching my options. The inheritance was substantial enough to pay off my student loans, put a down payment on a small house, and still have money left for starting my career. It represented freedom and possibility, but it could also save my family's business and home. By afternoon, I'd made my decision. I would offer to loan them half the money with a clear repayment plan and legal documentation. It was a compromise that would help them while still protecting my future. I found my parents in the living room, both looking haggard and stressed. Mom was on her phone with what sounded like a creditor, and Dad was staring at a stack of bills on the coffee table. "I've been thinking," I said, sitting down across from them. "I want to help, but I can't sign over the entire inheritance. What if I loan you half the money with—" "A loan?" Mom interrupted, ending her phone call abruptly. "You want to charge your own family interest?" I didn't say anything about interest. I just want a clear agreement about repayment so everyone knows what to expect. Dad shook his head. We don't need half the money, Jessica. We need all of it. The debts are bigger than we told you. Something in his tone made me pause. How much bigger? They exchanged a look that made my stomach drop. The business owes $200,000, Dad said quietly. The house has another $150 in liens. Your grandmother left you $320,000. I did the math quickly. That's almost exactly the total. It's like she knew, Mom said, her voice taking on a desperate edge. Like she left you that money specifically to save us. Or, I said slowly, you've known about the inheritance amount and planned this. The silence that followed confirmed my suspicion. They'd been counting on my grandmother's money long before today. This wasn't a last-minute crisis. This was a calculated plan. You've been planning this since Grandma died, I said, the pieces falling into place. That's why you've been so casual about me living here rent-free. You knew you'd get the money eventually. That's not, Dad started. It is, I said, standing up. You've been treating me like a temporary inconvenience because you thought my inheritance was your retirement plan. Mom's face flushed red. How dare you accuse us of manipulating you? We're your parents. Everything we do is for this family. Then why didn't you tell me the truth from the beginning? Why the guilt? Trips and emotional manipulation? Because we knew you'd react exactly like this, she snapped. Selfish and ungrateful. Wanting to honor my grandmother's wishes isn't selfish. Your grandmother is dead, Dad said harshly. We're alive and we need help. That should matter. More than the wishes of someone who isn't here anymore. The cruelty of his words hit me like a physical blow. Grandma Rosa had been more than just a grandmother to me. She'd been my mentor, my inspiration, and my biggest supporter. She'd taught me Spanish, shared stories of her struggles as an immigrant, and showed me what it meant to be a strong, independent woman. I can't do this, I said, my voice shaking. I won't dishonor her memory by throwing away everything she worked for. Fine, Mom said, her voice ice cold. Then you can leave. What? You heard me. If you're not going to help your family, then you're not family. Pack your things and get out. I stared at her, waiting for Dad to intervene, to tell her she was going too far. Instead, he nodded slowly. Maybe it's time you learned what the real world is like, he said. You think you're so independent? Prove it. You're throwing me out? On my birthday? You're throwing yourself out, Mom replied, by choosing money over family. The next few hours passed in a blur of disbelief and heartbreak. I packed my belongings while my parents watched television downstairs as if nothing was happening. Brandon helped me carry boxes to my car, tears streaming down his face. I'm sorry, he whispered as we loaded the last box. I tried to talk to them, but they won't listen. It's not your fault, I told him, fighting back my own tears. Take care of yourself, okay? As I drove away from the only home I'd ever known, I saw my parents through the living room window. They weren't sad or conflicted. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. They looked angry, like I'd betrayed them instead of the other way around. I spent that night in a cheap motel near the airport, crying until I had no tears left. My 22nd birthday had ended with me homeless and estranged from my family, all because I'd refused to give up my future to fix their mistakes. But as I lay in that uncomfortable bed, staring at the water-stained ceiling, I remembered something my grandmother used to say. Sometimes, mija, people show you who they really are when they think you have something they want. Pay attention. I was paying attention now. And what I saw was that my parents had never seen me as their daughter in that moment. They'd seen me as a bank account with legs. The next morning, I called Tyler, my boyfriend of 2 years. We'd been long distance while I finished school, but he'd moved to Phoenix a month ago for work. He picked me up from the motel and listened without judgment as I told him everything. You can stay with me, he said immediately, for as long as you need. I don't want to impose. You're not imposing. You're my girlfriend, and you need help. That's what people who love each other do. It was a stark contrast to my family's definition of love, which apparently came with conditions and price tags. Over the next few days, I tried to process what had happened. I called my parents several times, hoping they'd come to their senses, but they refused to speak to me. According to Brandon, who texted me updates, they were telling everyone that I'd abandoned the family in their time of need. The story they were spreading painted me as a spoiled brat who cared more about money than family loyalty. They conveniently left out the part where they'd tried to manipulate me into signing over my entire inheritance, or that they'd thrown me out on my birthday for refusing. A week after the confrontation, I was having lunch with my best friend, Rachel Davis, when my phone started buzzing frantically. Multiple calls from Mom, Dad, and even Brandon. I ignored the first few, but when my phone rang for the 10th time in 5 minutes, Rachel grabbed it. "Answer it," she said. "Something must be wrong." I picked up on what must have been the 15th call. "Jessica?" Mom's voice was panicked and breathless. "Thank God. We need you to come home right now." "I don't have a home there anymore, remember?" "This isn't the time for attitude. Something's happened with our accounts. All our cards were declined at the grocery store, and the bank says there's a freeze on everything." I felt a cold satisfaction settle in my chest. That sounds like a you problem. "Jessica, please. We can't access any of our money. The bank won't tell us anything. Over the phone. We need you here." "Why would you need me? I'm just the ungrateful daughter who abandoned the family, right?" We may have made a mistake." Dad's voice came through the phone, clearly on speaker. "But right now, we need to figure out what's happening with our accounts. Figure it out yourselves. You made it very clear that I'm not family." I hung up and turned off my phone. Rachel was staring at me with wide eyes. "What do you think happened?" she asked. I thought about it for a moment, remembering something my grandmother had mentioned about setting up financial protections. She'd been very careful about money, having grown up with nothing. "I think," I said slowly, "that Grandma Rosa might have protected her money better than anyone realized." That evening, I turned my phone back on to find dozens of missed calls and increasingly desperate voicemails. In the last one, Dad's voice was shaking. "Jessica, please call us back. We're at the bank, and they're saying there are legal complications with our accounts. Something about fraud protection and inheritance law. We need your help to sort this out." I smiled for the first time since my birthday. My grandmother had always been 3 steps ahead of everyone else. If she'd built protections into the inheritance, she'd probably anticipated exactly this situation. I called the law firm that had handled Grandma's estate. "Ms. Torres," the lawyer said when I identified myself, "I've been expecting your call. Your grandmother left very specific instructions about what to do if anyone attempted to coerce you into signing over your inheritance." "What kind of instructions?" "She set up fraud alerts on any accounts associated with people who might pressure you. If certain keywords were reported to our office, or if you were to inform us of any coercion attempts, we were authorized to freeze all related accounts pending investigation." I felt a chill run down my spine. Related accounts? Your parents? Business accounts? Personal accounts? Credit cards? Everything. Your grandmother was very thorough. She also left a letter for you, to be delivered only if these protections were triggered. An hour later, I was sitting in the law office, holding an envelope with my name on it in my grandmother's familiar handwriting. Inside was a letter that made everything clear. "My dearest Jessica," it began. "If you are reading this, it means your parents have tried to take what I left for you. I am not surprised. I love my son, but I know his weaknesses, and I know your mother's influence over him. They have always been better at spending money than earning it, and they have always expected others to solve their problems. The letter went on to explain that Grandma had known about their financial troubles for months before she died. She'd refused to help them directly because she knew they wouldn't learn from their mistakes. Instead, she'd set up a complex system of financial protections designed to teach them a lesson about consequences. The accounts will remain frozen until they acknowledge their treatment of you and agree to seek financial counseling, the letter continued. I have also arranged for alternative funding to prevent them from losing the house, but only if they meet certain conditions. You have the power to trigger these protections, but only if you choose to. Remember, Mija, sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the chance to face the consequences of their actions. The letter ended with instructions for accessing a separate account that Grandma had set up for my immediate needs, along with contact information for a financial advisor she'd trusted. I sat in that office for a long time, holding the letter, and thinking about everything that had happened. My parents had thrown me out for refusing to give up my inheritance, not knowing that their attempt to coerce me had triggered a series of consequences my grandmother had carefully planned. Next morning, I called them back. "Jessica!" Mom's voice was frantic when she answered. "Where have you been? We've been calling for days." "I've been getting legal advice about the inheritance," I said calmly. "Legal advice? What kind of legal advice?" "The kind that explains why your accounts are frozen and what you need to do to unfreeze them." There was a long pause. "What do you mean?" Dad's voice came through the speaker, wary now. "I mean that Grandma Rosa anticipated that you might try to pressure me into giving up my inheritance. She built protections into her estate plan." "That's impossible," Mom said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Is it?" She was a smart woman who understood people very well. She knew that if you were desperate enough, you might try to manipulate me. She also knew that if you did, you'd need to learn some hard lessons about consequences. I could hear them whispering to each other in Spanish, trying to figure out what this meant for them. "What do we need to do?" Dad asked finally. "First, you need to acknowledge that throwing me out on my birthday was wrong. Second, you need to agree to financial counseling to address the spending and debt management issues that got you into this mess. Third, you need to understand that my inheritance is mine, not a family piggy bank. And if we do those things, then Grandma's trust will release funds to help you save the house and business. But there will be conditions and oversight to ensure you don't end up in the same situation again." The silence stretched on for so long, I wondered if they'd hung up. "We need time to think about this," Mom said finally. "Take all the time you need. But remember, every day your accounts stay frozen is another day closer to losing everything. Grandma's plan has alternatives built in, but your stubbornness doesn't." I hung up and sat back in Tyler's apartment, feeling a complex mix of emotions. I was sad that it had come to this, but also proud of my grandmother for anticipating the situation and protecting me. She'd given me the tools to stand up for myself, even from beyond the grave. 3 days later, my parents called and asked if we could meet to talk. We agreed to meet at a family restaurant in Scottsdale, neutral ground where they couldn't storm out or throw me out again. They looked exhausted when I arrived, older somehow than they had just 2 weeks earlier. The stress of having their accounts frozen had clearly taken a toll. "We've been thinking about what you said," Dad began carefully. "And maybe we handled things wrong." "Maybe?" I raised an eyebrow. Mom shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "We were desperate, Jessica. The thought of losing everything we'd worked for, it made us panic. So you decided to sacrifice my future for your mistakes?" "We didn't see it that way," Dad said. "We saw it as family helping family." "But you didn't ask for help. You demanded my entire inheritance and threw me out when I refused. They couldn't argue with that because it was exactly what had happened." "We're sorry," Mom said quietly. "We let our fear control us, and we hurt you in the process." It was the first genuine apology I'd heard from them since the whole ordeal began. "I'm willing to work with you," I said. "But things have to change. You can't treat me like a child when it's convenient and then expect me to solve your adult problems. And you can't throw me out of the family when I don't do what you want." "We never wanted to throw you out," Dad protested. "But you did. On my birthday. For refusing to give up the money my grandmother left specifically for me." They sat with that truth for a moment, perhaps really understanding for the first time how their actions had looked from my perspective. "What happens now?" Mom asked. I pulled out the papers the lawyer had given me. "Now you agree to financial counseling, and I trigger the release of emergency funds to save the house and business. But there will be oversight, and you'll have to prove you're making better financial decisions. And your inheritance stays mine, just like Grandma intended." Dad nodded slowly. "That's fair. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation. There was still hurt and broken trust that would take time to heal. But it was a beginning. And for the first time since my birthday, I felt like I was standing on solid ground." As we signed the papers that would start their financial rehabilitation and my journey toward independence, I thought about my grandmother's wisdom. She'd known that sometimes you have to let people face consequences to truly help them. She'd also known that I'd need the strength to stand up for myself when the time came. The inheritance wasn't just money. It was a lesson in self-respect, family dynamics, and the difference between love and manipulation. My parents had learned that their daughter wasn't a bank account to be emptied at will. And I had learned that sometimes the people who claim to love you most are the ones who most need to be reminded of your worth. 2 months later, as I signed the lease on my first apartment and started my new job at a marketing firm in downtown Phoenix, I realized that my 22nd birthday had been the worst and best day of my life. It had cost me my illusions about my family, but it had given me something more valuable: the knowledge that I could stand on my own 2 feet. And every time I looked at the photo of my grandmother that I'd hung in my new living room, I could almost hear her voice saying, "Fly, Mija, you've got strong wings." 6 months had passed since the family restaurant meeting, and while things weren't perfect between my parents and me, we'd found a fragile equilibrium. They were attending financial counseling sessions twice a week, and the emergency funds from Grandma's trust had prevented them from losing the house and shop. I was thriving in my new job at Phoenix Marketing Solutions, handling social media campaigns for local businesses, and finally feeling like I was building the career Grandma had dreamed of for me. Tyler and I had moved into a cozy 2-bedroom apartment in Central Phoenix, splitting expenses and building a life together that felt stable and hopeful. The inheritance money I'd invested was growing steadily, and I'd even started a small side business helping other young professionals navigate family financial pressure through online consultations. It seemed like Grandma's wisdom was continuing to ripple outward, helping others find their own strength. But I should have known that the calm wouldn't last forever. It started with small things I almost didn't notice. Brandon texted me less frequently, and when he did, his messages felt strained and formal. When I called him directly, he was often busy or couldn't talk long. I assumed it was normal college stress until Rachel mentioned seeing him at a coffee shop near ASU looking upset and distracted. He was with some guy in an expensive suit, she told me over lunch at our favorite Mexican place downtown. They were having what looked like a serious conversation, and Brandon kept checking his phone like he was expecting bad news. Maybe it was about internships or jobs, I suggested. But something about her description made me uneasy. Brandon was usually confident and outgoing, not the type to look worried during professional meetings. The uneasiness turned into real concern when Tyler came home from work with an odd expression on his face. "I need to tell you something," he said, setting down his laptop bag and turning to face me. "My buddy Carlos works at Valley National Bank, and he mentioned something today that doesn't sit right." "What kind of something?" He said he processed some paperwork recently for a Torres family account, and there were irregularities that made him flag it for review. When he saw my last name was different, but mentioned I lived with a Torres, he got curious and looked deeper. My stomach started to knot. What kind of irregularities? Withdrawals that didn't match the account holder's typical patterns. Someone's been accessing accounts that should have been restricted under the financial counseling agreement. I felt the familiar chill that came whenever my family's financial decisions threatened to derail everything. Are you saying my parents are breaking the terms of the trust? I'm saying someone is, and Carlos thinks it might be more than just overspending. He mentioned potential identity theft or fraudulent account access. That evening, I called the law firm that managed Grandma's estate. The lawyer, Mrs. Patterson, confirmed my worst fears. We've been monitoring the account activity as required by your grandmother's instructions, she said, her voice carefully professional. There have been several concerning transactions in the past month that appear to violate the terms of the financial counseling agreement. What kind of transactions? Large cash withdrawals, transfers to accounts we don't have records for, and credit applications that shouldn't have been possible given the restrictions in place. So they're stealing again? It's more complicated than that. The transactions appear to be coming from an account associated with your brother's student information. Someone has been using his identity to open new credit lines and access funds. My heart sank. Brandon was 19 years old, barely old enough to understand complex financial products, let alone navigate the kind of scheme Mrs. Patterson was describing. Is Brandon in trouble? Potentially, yes. If he's knowingly participating in fraudulent activity, he could face serious legal consequences. If he's being manipulated or coerced, he's still liable for the debts being created in his name. I hung up the phone and immediately tried calling Brandon. It went straight to voicemail. I tried texting, asking him to call me as soon as possible. No response. By the next morning, I was genuinely worried. I drove to ASU's campus and waited outside his dorm building until I saw him heading to class. He looked terrible, exhausted and jumpy, constantly checking his phone. Brandon, I called, out jogging to catch up with him. He turned around, and the expression on his face when he saw me was pure panic. Jessica, I can't talk right now. I'm late for class. You're avoiding me. What's going on? He glanced around nervously as if he expected someone to be watching us. Nothing's going on. Everything's fine. It's not fine. I know about the account activity, about the credit applications. Brandon, are Mom and Dad making you do things with your student accounts? His face went pale. How do you know about that? Because Grandma set up monitoring systems to protect her money, and those systems flagged unusual activity. Brandon, if you're in trouble, I can help you. You can't help with this, he said, his voice breaking slightly. It's too complicated, and I'm in too deep. Too deep in what? He looked around again, then grabbed my arm and pulled me toward a bench away from the main walkway. After you left, he began, his voice barely above a whisper. Things got really bad at home. Mom and Dad were fighting constantly about money, about you, about everything. The financial counseling wasn't working because they kept finding ways around the restrictions. What ways? They figured out that since I'm over 18, I could open my own accounts and credit cards. They convinced me it was temporary, just to help with some emergency expenses while they got back on their feet. My heart was breaking for him. Brandon, that's fraud. Using your credit to pay their debts is illegal. I know that now, he said miserably. But at first, it seemed harmless. Just a few $100s here and there. Then it got bigger, and they said they needed me to take out student loans beyond what I actually needed for school. How much bigger? I think I'm responsible for about $40,000 in debt that has nothing to do with my education. I felt sick. Brandon, This could ruin your credit for years. It could affect your ability to get jobs, rent apartments, buy a car. I know, he said, his voice cracking. But every time I try to say no, they remind me that you abandoned the family and I'm all they have left. They say if I don't help them, we'll lose everything and it'll be my fault. The manipulation was sickeningly familiar. They'd tried the same guilt and pressure tactics on me, but I'd had Grandma's protection and my own financial independence. Brandon was trapped in their web with no clear way out. Listen to me, I said, taking his hands. You are not responsible for their financial mistakes, and you are not responsible for saving them from the consequences of their choices. But what if they're right? What if the family falls apart because I won't help? The family fell apart the moment they decided to use their children as personal ATMs instead of dealing with their problems like adults. Brandon was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. There's more, he said finally. They've been talking about getting you to sign over part of your inheritance again. They think if they can show that the family is in crisis because of student debt, you'll feel guilty enough to help. Is that why you've been avoiding me? Partly, but also because I'm ashamed. I let them talk me into this mess, and now I don't know how to get out without destroying what's left of our family. I thought about what Grandma would have done in this situation. She'd have found a way to protect Brandon while still holding my parents accountable for their choices. I'm going to help you, I said, but we're going to do this the right way, with legal protection and clear boundaries. How? First, we're going to document everything. Every debt they've convinced you to take on, every time they've pressured you, every promise they've made about paying you back. Then we're going to meet with Mrs. Patterson and figure out how to protect you from further financial abuse. Financial abuse? That's what this is, Brandon. Using your credit and identity to pay their debts without your full understanding of the consequences is a form of financial abuse, even if they're family. That afternoon, we spent 3 hours in a quiet corner of the ASU library going through Brandon's credit reports, bank statements, and loan documents. The scope of what my parents had done was staggering. They'd helped him open 5 different credit cards, taken out unnecessary student loans, and even co-signed for a car loan that had nothing to do with his transportation needs. The car isn't even for me, he admitted. Mom's been driving it, because hers was repossessed. I took photos of every document, every statement, every piece of evidence that showed how my parents had systematically exploited their 19-year-old son's credit to fund their lifestyle. Are you ready to stop this? I asked him. I'm scared, he said honestly. What if they cut me off completely? What if I can't afford to finish school? Then I'll help you finish school. Grandma's inheritance is more than enough to support both our educations and futures, which is exactly what she intended. I can't ask you to do that. You're not asking, I'm offering, because that's what family is supposed to do. Protect each other, not exploit each other. The next morning, I called Mrs. Patterson and scheduled an emergency meeting. Tyler insisted on coming with us for moral support, and Rachel offered to be there as a witness if needed. Mrs. Patterson listened carefully as Brandon explained what had been happening, occasionally asking clarifying questions or requesting specific documents. Her expression grew progressively more serious as the scope of the financial manipulation became clear. This is definitely financial abuse, she confirmed when Brandon finished his account. Your parents have systematically exploited your youth and inexperience to circumvent the restrictions placed on their access to family funds. What can we do? I asked. Several things. First, we can trigger the fraud protection mechanisms your grandmother built into the trust. This will freeze any accounts that have been compromised and alert credit agencies to potential identity theft. Will that hurt Brandon's credit? Short term, yes. But long term, it will protect him from further damage and provide a paper trail if we need to pursue legal action against your parents. Brandon looked terrified. Legal action? It may not come to that, Mrs. Patterson said gently. But you need to understand that what they've done is illegal. Using your identity to circumvent financial restrictions and taking on debt in your name without your full consent is fraud, regardless of family relationships. What about school? Brandon asked. If they cut me off financially, I can't afford tuition. I looked at Mrs. Patterson. Can the trust provide emergency educational funding? Actually, yes. Your grandmother anticipated that your parents might try to use financial control to manipulate family members. She set aside funds specifically for educational expenses for any grandchildren who might need protection from financial coercion. Brandon's eyes filled with tears. She thought of everything, didn't she? Your grandmother understood family dynamics very well, Mrs. Patterson said with a slight smile. She'd seen how money could be used as a weapon, and she wanted to make sure future generations had alternatives. That evening, we implemented the plan. Mrs. Patterson filed the necessary paperwork to freeze the compromised accounts and alert credit agencies. I helped Brandon craft a careful message to our parents explaining that he could no longer participate in their financial schemes and that he'd be living independently from now on. The response was swift and predictable. My phone started ringing within an hour, and when I finally answered, Mom's voice was shrill with panic. "What have you done?" she demanded. "All our cards are declined again, and the bank is saying there are fraud alerts on our accounts." "I haven't done anything," I said calmly. "But Brandon decided he couldn't continue letting you use his credit to pay your debts. You turned him against us." I showed him that he had options besides being financially exploited by his own parents. We weren't exploiting him. We were teaching him about family responsibility. You were teaching him that family means being used and manipulated. That's not the lesson Grandma wanted him to learn. Dad got on the phone, his voice tight with controlled anger. "You're destroying this family, Jessica. First you refused to help when we needed it, and now you're convincing Brandon to abandon us too." "I'm not convincing him of anything. I'm giving him the same choice you gave me, the choice to protect his future or sacrifice it for your mistakes. It's not that simple." "It's exactly that simple. You can't use your children's credit and futures to fix problems you created. If you want help, you need to ask for it honestly, without manipulation or coercion." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, cycling through anger, guilt trips, and desperate bargaining. But for the first time, I felt completely confident in my position. I had Grandma's wisdom, legal backing, and the knowledge that I was protecting my brother from financial ruin. When I finally hung up, Tyler wrapped his arms around me. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Sad," I admitted, but also relieved. Brandon's going to be okay, and that's what matters most. Brandon moved out of the dorm and into our apartment temporarily while he figured out his next steps. With the trust's educational fund covering his tuition and living expenses, he was able to focus on his studies without the constant pressure of his parents' financial demands. The fraud alerts triggered a full investigation of my parents' financial activities, revealing a pattern of manipulation and questionable decisions that went back several years. They'd been using family members' credit, manipulating financial aid applications, and circumventing legal restrictions long before my inheritance became available. The good news, Mrs. Patterson explained during a follow-up meeting, is that Brandon won't be held responsible for the debts he was coerced into taking on. The investigation has established a clear pattern of financial abuse. And the bad news? Your parents are facing potential criminal charges for fraud and identity theft. The district attorney's office is reviewing the case to determine whether to prosecute. I felt a complex mix of emotions. I didn't want to see my parents go to jail, but I also couldn't ignore the fact that they'd committed serious crimes against their own children. What happens to the house and business? That depends on whether they can demonstrate genuine financial rehabilitation. The trust still has provisions for helping them, but only if they meet very strict conditions and accept ongoing oversight. 2 weeks later, my parents requested a meeting. This time, they came alone, without lawyers or dramatic demands. They looked older, defeated, and genuinely remorseful in a way I'd never seen before. "We've been thinking about everything that's happened," Mom said, her voice quiet and strained. "And we realize we've made terrible mistakes. We let our fear and pride turn us into people we didn't recognize," Dad added. "We hurt both of you, and we're sorry." It was the first time they'd acknowledged the harm they'd caused without trying to justify it or shift blame. "What do you want from us?" I asked. "We want to make this right," Mom said. "We don't know how, but we want to try." I looked at Brandon, who'd insisted on being present for the conversation. He nodded slightly, giving me permission to speak for both of us. "Making it right means accepting full responsibility for your choices and their consequences," I said. "It means acknowledging that you financially abused your children and that this pattern needs to stop permanently." "We know," Dad said. "We've been meeting with a counselor who specializes in financial addiction and family dysfunction. She's helping us understand how we got to this point." "It doesn't excuse what we did," Mom added quickly, "but it's helping us see patterns we didn't recognize before." We talked for over an hour, and for the first time in months, it felt like a genuine conversation rather than a manipulation session. They listened when we explained how their actions had affected us, and they didn't try to minimize the damage or shift responsibility. "The district attorney hasn't decided whether to file charges," I told them. "But Mrs. Patterson says that if you voluntarily enter a comprehensive financial rehabilitation program and make restitution to Brandon, it might influence their decision." "What kind of restitution?" Dad asked. "Paying off all the debt you convinced him to take on, plus compensation for the damage to his credit and the stress you caused." "That's fair," Mom said without hesitation. "More than fair." 6 months later, my parents had completed their financial rehabilitation program and successfully paid off all of Brandon's fraudulent debts. The district attorney decided not to file criminal charges, but the civil settlements and restitution payments had essentially wiped out their savings. They were starting over financially, but this time with proper budgeting skills, realistic expectations, and a clear understanding of the difference between family support and family exploitation. Brandon had thrived in his new independence, maintaining excellent grades while working part-time and building healthy financial habits. He'd even started a campus organization to help other students recognize and resist financial manipulation by family members. "It's amazing how many people deal with this," he told me during one of our weekly coffee meetings. "Parents who pressure kids to take out unnecessary loans, relatives who use family guilt to access money, grandparents who threaten to cut off inheritance unless you make certain choices." "Grandma would be proud of you for helping them," I said. "I think she'd be proud of both of us for learning to set boundaries." As for Tyler and me, we'd moved into a larger apartment and were seriously discussing marriage and future plans. The inheritance money had grown substantially through careful investing, and I'd used part of it to expand my side business into a full-scale financial advocacy service for young adults dealing with family pressure. "You've turned your grandmother's gift into something that helps hundreds of people," Tyler observed as we looked over my business quarterly reports. "That's what she would have wanted," I replied. "Money that creates independence and opportunity, not dependency and control." The final piece of the puzzle came on a warm Arizona evening when my parents invited us over for dinner. It was the first time in over a year that we'd all been in the same room without legal representation or mediation. The house looked different, smaller somehow, but also more peaceful. They'd downsized their lifestyle significantly, selling unnecessary possessions and focusing on what truly mattered. "We have something for you," Mom said after dinner, handing me a thick folder. Inside were documents showing that they'd established college funds for any future grandchildren, complete with legal protections to ensure the money could never be accessed for other purposes. We want to make sure the next generation never has to deal with the financial stress we created, Dad explained. We also want you to know that we've added clauses to our own financial planning to prevent us from ever again using family members' credit or identity, Mom added. It wasn't a complete reconciliation. There was still hurt and broken trust that would take years to fully heal. But it was a genuine acknowledgement of responsibility and a commitment to change. As we drove home that night, I thought about the journey from my 22nd birthday to this moment. It had been painful, complicated, and sometimes heartbreaking. But it had also taught me invaluable lessons about self-respect, family dynamics, and the difference between love and manipulation. Do you think your grandmother knew it would all work out like this? Tyler asked. I considered the question carefully. I think she knew that if she gave me the tools to stand up for myself, I'd figure out how to use them. She trusted me to make good decisions even when those decisions were difficult. And Brandon? She knew that protecting me would eventually mean protecting him too. That's how family is supposed to work, each generation looking out for the next one. The inheritance had never really been about money. It had been about independence, self-respect, and the courage to set boundaries even with people you love. Grandma Rosa had given me more than financial security. She'd given me the strength to choose my own path and the wisdom to help others find theirs. And every time I looked at the photo of her in our living room, I could almost hear her voice, saying, Mija, you learned to fly. Now teach others to spread their wings. 2 years had passed since the family dinner that marked our tentative reconciliation, and life had settled into a rhythm that felt sustainable and healthy. My financial advocacy business, Desert Wings Consulting, had grown beyond anything I'd imagined, with clients across the Southwest seeking help with family financial boundaries and young adult independence planning. Brandon was thriving as a junior at ASU, majoring in social work with a focus on family counseling, clearly inspired by our own journey through dysfunction toward healing. Tyler and I had gotten engaged 6 months earlier, and we were planning a small wedding for the following spring. The engagement ring had been purchased with money I'd earned through my business, a symbol of the independence Grandma Rosa had envisioned for me. My parents seemed genuinely supportive of our relationship, though there was still an underlying tension whenever money came up in conversation. The business had grown large enough that I'd hired 2 part-time employees and was considering expanding into online courses and workshops. The inheritance money had been the seed, but everything that grew from it was the result of hard work and the lessons I'd learned about standing up for myself and others. But success, I was learning, could attract new kinds of problems. It started with a phone call on a Tuesday morning in October. I was reviewing client files in my home office when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Jessica Torres. The voice was professional, clipped, and slightly familiar. Yes, this is Jessica. This is Detective Maria Santos with the Phoenix Police Department Financial Crimes Unit. I need to speak with you about some irregularities that have come to our attention regarding your business accounts. My blood ran cold. What kind of irregularities? It would be better if we discuss this in person. Can you come to the station this afternoon? Am I in trouble? You're not under arrest, Ms. Torres, but there are some questions we need to ask about recent financial activity connected to your business. I spent the rest of the morning in a state of controlled panic, calling Mrs. Patterson and Tyler to let them know what was happening. Mrs. Patterson agreed to meet me at the police station, and Tyler took the afternoon off work to drive me there. Detective Santos was a woman in her 40s with graying hair and sharp eyes that seemed to see everything. She led us into a small conference room where another detective, a younger man named Rodriguez, was waiting with a thick folder of documents. Ms. Torres, Detective Santos began, we're investigating a complaint filed by someone claiming that your business has been operating fraudulently and that you've been using family connections to manipulate vulnerable clients. That's ridiculous, I said immediately. I help people establish financial independence from manipulative family members. I don't manipulate anyone. The complaint suggests otherwise. It alleges that you've been encouraging clients to cut off family relationships for financial gain, that you're operating without proper licenses, and that you've been misrepresenting your qualifications. Mrs. Patterson leaned forward. Who filed this complaint? Detective Rodriguez consulted his notes. The complainant is listed as Karen Torres. I believe that's your mother? The room seemed to spin slightly. My mother filed a police complaint against my business? The complaint alleges that you've been running an unlicensed counseling service, providing financial advice without proper certification and using your personal family situation to manipulate emotionally vulnerable young adults into cutting ties with their families. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. That's not what I do at all. I help people set healthy boundaries and recognize financial manipulation. I don't tell anyone to cut off their families. Do you have proper licensing for the services you provide? Detective Santos asked. I operate as a consultant, not a therapist or financial advisor. I help people understand their options and connect them with properly licensed professionals when needed. Everything I do is legal and ethical. Mrs. Patterson pulled out her own folder. Detective, I represent Ms. Torres and can provide documentation of her business structure, licensing, and operating procedures. Everything has been set up in compliance with Arizona law. We spent the next hour going through the allegations, point by point. The complaint painted a picture of me as a predatory consultant who preyed on family conflicts for profit, charging excessive fees to help ungrateful children steal money from their loving parents. The complaint also alleges that your business was funded through fraudulent means, Detective Rodriguez said, reading from his notes. Something about an inheritance that was obtained through manipulation of an elderly relative. That's completely false, I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. My grandmother left me that inheritance specifically because she knew my parents would try to manipulate me into giving it up. She built protections into her will to prevent exactly what they tried to do. And yet, Detective Santos said carefully, your parents have now filed a complaint suggesting that you manipulated your grandmother into changing her will to exclude them from their rightful inheritance. I stared at her, trying to process what I was hearing. They're lying. My grandmother's will was written years before she died, and she left detailed documentation of her reasons. Mrs. Patterson was already pulling out more documents. Detective, I have copies of the original will, correspondence between Mrs. Rosa Torres and her legal team, and medical documentation showing that she was of sound mind when she made these decisions. We'll need to review all of that, Detective Santos said. But for now, Ms. Torres, I need to ask you not to conduct any business activities until this investigation is complete. You're shutting down my business based on false accusations from people with a clear financial motive to lie? We're asking you to suspend operations while we investigate the allegations. If everything is legitimate, you'll be able to resume normal activities once we complete our review. Driving home from the police station, I felt like I was trapped in a nightmare that kept evolving into new forms of torture. Tyler was furious, ranting about false accusations and police overreach, while Mrs. Patterson was already planning our legal response. They can't shut down your business based solely on your mother's word, she said from the back seat. But they can make things difficult while they investigate, especially if other complaints start coming in. Other complaints? If your mother is smart, and unfortunately she seems to be, she'll try to get other people to file similar complaints. It's a common tactic in harassment campaigns. I thought about my client list, people I'd helped establish independence from financially manipulative families. How many of those families might be angry enough to file false complaints if my mother reached out to them? Can we fight this? Absolutely. But it's going to take time, money, and energy. And unfortunately, the damage to your reputation might happen faster than we can prove your innocence. That evening, Tyler and I sat in our living room trying to process what had happened. The business I'd built from nothing, The career that represented everything my grandmother had wanted for me was under attack from the very people who'd inspired me to start it in the first place. "Why now?" Tyler asked. "Things have been good between you and your parents for over a year. Why would they suddenly decide to destroy your business?" I thought about it, trying to identify what might have triggered this new attack. Then I remembered something from the previous month's family dinner. "The engagement," I said suddenly. "When we announced our engagement, Mom made a comment about how expensive weddings are these days. She asked if I was planning to use family money to pay for it. And you said you were paying for it yourself with money you'd earned through the business." Exactly. She got this look on her face, like she was realizing for the first time that the business was actually successful and profitable. Tyler's expression darkened. "You think they're going after your business because they want access to the money you're making?" "I think they see it as an extension of the inheritance they never got. In their minds, anything I earn using Grandma's money as seed capital belongs to the family." My phone buzzed with a text from Brandon. "Emergency. Can you come over? Something's happened." We drove to Brandon's apartment near campus, finding him pacing in his small living room with his laptop open on the coffee table. His face was pale and his hands were shaking slightly. "They came to see me today," he said without preamble. "Mom and Dad. They said you were in trouble with the police and that I needed to help them protect the family." "Protect the family from what?" "From you. They said you've been lying about what happened with the inheritance, that you manipulated Grandma Rosa into leaving you money that should have been distributed equally among all the grandchildren." I sat down heavily on his couch. "Brandon, you know that's not true. You were there when everything happened." "I know, but they have documents now. Something they say proves that Grandma was confused when she wrote her will." "What kind of documents?" Brandon turned his laptop toward me. On the screen was a medical report dated just 3 months before Grandma's death, stating that she'd been treated for confusion and memory problems related to her medication. "Where did they get this?" I asked, studying the document. "They said they found it in her papers when they were cleaning out her house. They claim it proves she wasn't mentally competent when she made decisions about the inheritance." Tyler looked over my shoulder at the screen. "This could be fabricated. Medical records are strictly protected, so how would they have access to something like this?" "That's what I was thinking," Brandon said. "But they also had this." He pulled up another document, this one purporting to be a letter from Grandma Rosa to a lawyer, expressing doubts about her will and requesting changes that would distribute the inheritance more equally among family members. I read the letter carefully, my heart sinking as I recognized phrases and language that sounded authentic. But something felt wrong about the whole thing. "Brandon, did they ask you to do anything specific?" "They want me to sign a statement saying that you pressured me to lie about the financial abuse, that I was never actually coerced into taking on debt, and that you convinced me to file false reports against them. And if you don't sign?" They said they'd have to tell the police that I was your accomplice in defrauding the inheritance. They showed me legal documents that could implicate me in fraud charges. I felt the familiar rage building, the same anger I'd experienced when they first tried to manipulate me into giving up my inheritance. But this time, they weren't just going after me. They were threatening Brandon's future to force him to participate in their lies. "They're escalating," I said to Tyler. "First, they tried to take my inheritance directly. Then they used Brandon's credit to steal money indirectly. Now they're trying to destroy my business and force Brandon to lie. For them. What do we do?" I pulled out my phone and called Mrs. Patterson, putting her on speaker so Brandon could hear. "Mrs. Patterson, they're trying to get Brandon to sign a false statement recanting his testimony about the financial abuse. They're threatening him with fraud charges if he doesn't comply." "That's witness intimidation and coercion," she said, immediately. "Brandon, do not sign anything they give you. In fact, I want you to document every interaction you have with them from now on. What about the medical records they showed him? Tyler asked. Medical records from that time period would have been part of the original probate process. If there were genuine concerns about Mrs. Rosa Torres's mental competency, they would have been raised during the initial will validation. The fact that these documents are surfacing now, 2 years later, is highly suspicious. So, they're probably fake? Almost certainly. But we'll need to have them authenticated, which takes time. Meanwhile, they can use them to create doubt and support their false narrative. After Mrs. Patterson hung up, the three of us sat in Brandon's living room trying to process the scope of what our parents were attempting. They're not just attacking your business, Brandon said quietly. They're trying to rewrite the entire history of what happened. If they can convince people that Grandma was mentally incompetent and that you manipulated her, they can challenge the validity of the will itself, which would put the inheritance back into probate and give them another chance to claim it, Tyler finished. But that's not all, I realized. If they can prove that my business was built on fraudulently obtained money, they can claim damages against everything I've earned. They're not just trying to get the inheritance, they're trying to take everything I've built with it. The next morning brought more bad news. Mrs. Patterson called to tell me that 3 more complaints had been filed against my business, all from parents of clients I'd helped establish financial independence. It's clearly a coordinated campaign, she said. The complaints all use similar language and make identical allegations. Your mother has been busy contacting your former clients' families. Can people really file false police reports like this without consequences? They can file reports based on their perspective of events, even if that perspective is biased or incomplete. The challenge is proving that the reports are deliberately false rather than just misguided. How long will this take to resolve? Months, possibly longer. And Jessica, I need to warn you that this could get worse before it gets better. If they're successful in creating enough doubt about your business practices, you could face regulatory challenges even after the criminal investigation is dropped. That afternoon, Tyler and I met with a crisis management consultant who specialized in reputation defense for small businesses. The consultant, David Chen, had dealt with similar cases involving family-initiated harassment campaigns. The good news, he said after reviewing my situation, is that you have a strong track record and genuine client testimonials. The bad news is that false accusations can spread faster than fact-checking, especially when they involve family conflict and money. What's our strategy? Document everything, maintain complete transparency with authorities, and prepare a comprehensive defense of your business practices. But also prepare for the possibility that you might need to temporarily rebrand or relocate to escape the damage. Relocate? Family harassment campaigns like this often target not just the business, but the person's entire life in a community. If your parents are determined to destroy your reputation in Phoenix, you might find it easier to start fresh somewhere else. The idea of leaving Phoenix, leaving the community I'd built and the clients who depended on me, felt like letting my parents win. But I was beginning to understand that this wasn't just about money anymore. This was about control, power, and their determination to punish me for establishing independence. That evening, Rachel came over with takeout and moral support. She'd been following the situation and had some insights that surprised me. I've been thinking about the timing of all this, she said as we ate Chinese food on my couch. Your parents waited 2 years to make these accusations. Why now? We think it's because the business has become successful enough to be worth attacking. Maybe. But I think there's something else. Have you looked at the dates on those medical records they showed Brandon? I pulled out copies of the documents. 3 months before Grandma died. Why? Because that's right around the time you started dating Tyler seriously. Remember, you brought him to that family barbecue and your grandmother really liked him? I did remember. Grandma Rosa had been delighted to meet Tyler and had spent the afternoon asking him about his goals and values. She'd pulled me aside, later to say she thought he was a good man who would support my independence rather than try to control me. You think the timing is connected to Tyler? I think your parents saw your relationship getting serious and realized that marriage would make you even more financially independent. A supportive partner who doesn't need their money or approval represents a permanent threat to their ability to control you. Tyler looked up from his lo mein. So they're trying to destroy Jessica's business and reputation before we get married, hoping to make her financially dependent on them again? It's a pattern, Rachel said. Financial abusers often escalate their tactics when they sense their victim is about to gain permanent independence through marriage, career success, or other life changes. The observation was chilling because it rang true. My parents had been relatively calm during the period when I was building my business, and they thought it was just a temporary venture. But as soon as it became clear that I was building lasting financial independence, and especially after Tyler and I announced our engagement, their behavior had shifted dramatically. If that's true, I said slowly, then they're not going to stop with false police reports. They'll keep escalating until they either regain control or completely destroy my ability to be independent. Which means we need to be prepared for whatever comes next, Tyler said grimly. What came next arrived the following Monday in the form of a civil lawsuit. My parents were suing me for the return of the inheritance, claiming that it had been obtained through fraud and elder manipulation. They were also suing my business for damages, claiming that I had used their family situation to build a fraudulent consulting practice. The lawsuit demanded not just the return of the original inheritance money, but also all the profits from my business, plus punitive damages for emotional distress and reputational harm to the family name. They're asking for almost $2 million, Mrs. Patterson said when she called to tell me about the filing. This is no longer just harassment. This is an attempt at financial destruction. Can they do this? Can they really sue me for building a successful business with money that was legally left to me? They can file the lawsuit, but winning it is another matter. However, the process itself will be expensive and time-consuming, and it will keep the allegations in the public eye for months or years. So even if we win, the damage to my reputation could destroy the business anyway. It's possible. That's often the point of these kinds of lawsuits. They're not necessarily intended to win, but to exhaust the defendant's resources and destroy their ability to fight back. That evening, Tyler and I sat in our living room surrounded by legal documents, financial records, and the remnants of the life we'd been building together. The wedding we'd been planning seemed impossibly frivolous now, and the future that had seemed so bright just weeks earlier was clouded with uncertainty. I won't let them destroy everything Grandma worked for, I said finally. If they want to fight, they'll get one. But this time, we're not playing defense. What do you mean? I mean it's time to stop reacting to their attacks and start exposing the truth about who they really are and what they've been doing. I pulled out my laptop and began typing, crafting a detailed timeline of every manipulation, every lie, and every attempt to control or exploit family members that my parents had engaged in over the past 3 years. If they want to make this public, I said as I typed, then let's make it all public. Every document, every recording, every piece of evidence that shows the real pattern of abuse in this family. Tyler read over my shoulder as I worked. Are you sure you want to escalate? Like this? Once you put this out there, there's no taking it back. There's already no taking it back. They made sure of that when they filed false police reports and a fraudulent lawsuit. Now it's time to make sure everyone knows the complete truth, not just their version of it. As I worked late into the night, documenting years of financial manipulation and emotional abuse, I thought about what my grandmother would have wanted me to do. She'd given me the tools to protect myself, but she'd also taught me that sometimes the best defense is a strong offense. The battle lines were drawn now, and there would be no more pretending that this was just a family disagreement about money. This was a war for the right to live independently, to build something meaningful, and to honor the legacy of a woman who'd believed in the power of education, hard work, and financial independence. My parents had made a critical error in judgment. They'd assumed that because I'd been quiet and accommodating in the past, I would continue to be passive in the face of their attacks. They'd forgotten that quiet doesn't mean weak, and that the granddaughter of Rosa Torres had learned more than just financial planning from her mentor. As I finished documenting the truth and prepared to fight back with everything I had, I could almost hear Grandma's voice encouraging me. "Mija, sometimes you have to weather the storm to prove that your roots go deep enough to survive anything." The storm was coming, but I was ready for it. The comprehensive defense document I'd spent weeks preparing was finally ready, and Mrs. Patterson had assembled a legal team that specialized in defending against frivolous family litigation. But the real breakthrough came from an unexpected source, one that would expose just how far my parents had been willing to go to destroy my independence. It started with a phone call from someone I'd never heard of before. Dr. Patricia Hernandez identified herself as the physician who had supposedly treated my grandmother for confusion and memory problems. She'd seen news coverage of the lawsuit and had some disturbing information to share. "Ms. Torres," she said when Tyler and I met her at her medical office in Scottsdale, "I need you to know that the medical records your parents are using as evidence are completely fabricated. Your grandmother was never my patient, and I never wrote any report questioning her mental competency." My heart started racing. "Are you certain?" "Absolutely certain. I've reviewed the documents, and while they appear to use my letterhead and signature, I can tell you definitively that I did not create them. Someone has forged medical records and used my identity to do it." Tyler leaned forward. "Doctor, would you be willing to testify to that in court?" "More than willing. Medical record forgery is a serious crime, and using my name and credentials without permission is identity theft. I've already contacted the medical board and the police about this." Mrs. Patterson was ecstatic when we called her with the news. "This changes everything. Not only can we prove that their key evidence is fraudulent, but we can file criminal complaints for forgery and identity theft." "What about the letter from Grandma supposedly requesting changes to her will?" "I've had that analyzed by a handwriting expert and a document authentication specialist. The paper is wrong for the date, the ink composition doesn't match other documents from that time period, and the handwriting shows signs of being traced rather than naturally written." "So both documents are fake?" "Both documents are fake, and your parents knowingly used them in legal proceedings. That's perjury, fraud, and possibly conspiracy. But even as we were building our case against my parents' fabricated evidence, they were escalating their attacks in ways I hadn't anticipated." The first sign came when Tyler arrived home from work looking shaken and angry. "They got me fired," he said without preamble. "What? Who got you fired?" "Your parents. Someone called my supervisor claiming to be a concerned citizen who'd discovered that my fiancé was under investigation for fraud. They said I might be involved in financial crimes and that the company should protect itself by terminating my employment." I felt sick. "Tyler, I'm so sorry. I never thought they'd go after your job. It gets worse." The caller also suggested that I'd been using my position at the bank to help you launder money through your business accounts. "That's insane. You work in IT, not in any financial capacity." "Doesn't matter. The mere suggestion of impropriety was enough for them to let me go pending investigation of the allegations. They said they couldn't risk the liability." Mrs. Patterson was furious when we told her about Tyler's termination. "This is a clear pattern of harassment and defamation. They're systematically attacking every aspect of your lives to try to force you into submission." "Can we do anything about it?" "We can add it to our counterclaims, and Tyler can file for wrongful termination. But the immediate problem is that they're not just attacking you anymore, Jessica. They're going after anyone who supports you. The truth of that became even clearer when Rachel called me in tears the next day. "Jessica, I'm so sorry, but I can't be your maid of honor anymore." "What happened?" "Someone has been calling my employer, my landlord, even my parents, claiming that I'm involved in your financial crimes. My boss told me that if I don't distance myself from you, they'll have to reconsider my position." "Rachel, you don't have to do this. We can fight back." "I know you can, but I can't risk my career. I have student loans, rent, my whole life depends on this job. I'm sorry, but I have to protect myself." After Rachel hung up, I sat in my kitchen feeling more isolated than I had since the day my parents threw me out. They weren't just attacking me anymore. They were systematically targeting everyone who supported me, creating a web of fear and intimidation designed to leave me completely alone. The strategy was working. Over the next week, several of my business clients canceled their contracts, citing concerns about the ongoing legal issues. My part-time employees quit, saying they couldn't afford to be associated with a business under investigation. Even my gym membership was canceled after someone complained to management about my presence making other members uncomfortable. "They're trying to make Phoenix uninhabitable for you," David Chen, the crisis management consultant, explained during an emergency meeting. "It's a classic isolation strategy. Cut off your support systems, destroy your professional relationships, and force you to choose between fighting and surviving." "So what do I do?" "You have two options. One, you can try to wait them out and hope that when the truth comes out, you can rebuild. Two, you can go on the offensive and expose what they're doing before they complete their destruction of your life." What would going on the offensive look like? Public exposure. Document everything they've done, every lie they've told, every person they've contacted, and make it all public. Social media, news outlets, legal filings, everything. Tyler looked concerned. "Isn't that risky? Won't it just escalate things further?" "Things are already escalated," I said grimly. "They've gotten you fired, intimidated Rachel into abandoning me, and are systematically destroying my business and reputation. How much worse can it get?" "They could escalate to physical threats or actual violence," David said seriously. "When financial manipulation and legal harassment don't work, some people move to more direct forms of intimidation." The possibility of physical threats hadn't occurred to me, but it made sense. If my parents were willing to forge medical records and ruin innocent people's careers, what other lines might they be willing to cross? That evening, as Tyler and I discussed our options, Brandon called with information that made our decision for us. "They're planning something big," he said, his voice tight with worry. "I overheard Mom on the phone with someone, talking about the final solution and making sure Jessica never recovers from this." "What kind of final solution?" "I don't know exactly, but she mentioned something about criminal charges that would stick, about having evidence that couldn't be disputed." "More forged documents?" "Maybe, or maybe something worse. Jessica, I think you need to be really careful. They're talking like this is war now, not just a family dispute." After Brandon hung up, Tyler and I made our decision. We would go public. With everything. Document every lie and manipulation, and force the truth into the open before my parents could execute whatever final plan they were developing. I spent the next 3 days creating a comprehensive website that detailed every aspect of the conflict. I included timeline documents, screenshots of threatening messages, copies of the forged medical records, expert testimony about the document fraud, and statements from clients whose families had been contacted with lies about my business. The website also included audio recordings I'd made of my parents threatening Brandon, copies of the lawsuit documents showing their fraudulent claims, and evidence of their campaign to destroy Tyler's career and intimidate my friends. When the site went live, I shared it across social media with a simple message. When parents use lies, fraud, and intimidation to destroy their child's independence, the truth needs to be told. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, the site had thousands of views and hundreds of shares. Local news outlets picked up the story, and suddenly, my family's private war was front-page news across Phoenix. "Local Woman Fights Parents' Fraud Campaign," read the headline in the Phoenix New Times. "Family Inheritance Battle Exposes Pattern of Financial Manipulation and Document Forgery." But my parents weren't done fighting. The morning after the website went live, Detective Santos called with news that chilled me to the bone. "Ms. Torres, I need to inform you that additional charges have been filed against you. Your parents are now claiming that you've been running an elaborate insurance fraud scheme using your grandmother's death and medical records. That's impossible. I've never filed any insurance claims related to my grandmother. The allegation is that you forged medical records to make it appear that your grandmother died from natural causes when she actually died under suspicious circumstances, and that you used falsified death certificates to claim life insurance, benefits that weren't rightfully yours." I felt the blood drain from my face. "Detective, my grandmother died in a hospital surrounded by family. There was never any question about the cause of death, and I never received any life insurance benefits." "I understand your position, but we're obligated to investigate all allegations. This is particularly serious because it involves potential fraud against insurance companies, which is a federal crime. They're escalating to false accusations of murder? The allegations don't specifically mention murder, but they do suggest that you may have been involved in concealing the true circumstances of your grandmother's death for financial gain." After Detective Santos hung up, I sat in my living room trying to process the magnitude of what my parents had done. They'd gone from trying to steal my inheritance to accusing me of being involved in my grandmother's death. There seemed to be no limit to how far they were willing to go. Mrs. Patterson was already preparing our response when I called her. "This is actually good news," she said, which surprised me. "How is being accused of insurance fraud and potentially murder good news?" "Because they've overplayed their hand. These allegations are so outrageous and easily disproven that they expose the malicious intent behind all their previous claims. Hospital records, death certificates, and insurance records are all carefully documented and impossible to forge convincingly. So we can prove these claims are false? We can prove them false within days. But more importantly, we can use their willingness to make such extreme false accusations to demonstrate to the court that all their previous claims should be viewed with extreme skepticism." The next few days were a whirlwind of media attention, legal maneuvering, and public support that surprised me. The website had generated hundreds of messages from people who'd experienced similar family financial manipulation, and several local attorneys had offered to help with the case pro bono. A prominent family law attorney named Jennifer Walsh reached out with an offer that changed everything. "Ms. Torres," she said when we met at her downtown office, "I've been following your case, and I think you're dealing with something much larger than a family dispute. What you're describing is a pattern of behavior that suggests personality disorders and potentially criminal intent." "What do you mean?" "The escalation pattern, the systematic targeting of support systems, the willingness to forge documents, and make false accusations. These aren't the actions of parents who are simply desperate for money. This is the behavior of people who view you as a threat to their control and are willing to destroy you rather than accept your independence." "So what do we do?" "We stop playing defense and start exposing them for what they really are. I have connections with investigative journalists, and I think it's time the public understood the full scope of what's been happening to you." Within a week, Jennifer had arranged for an investigative reporter from the Arizona Republic to do a comprehensive story on my case. The reporter, Michael Chen, spent days reviewing documents, interviewing witnesses, and researching my parents' financial history. What he discovered was shocking even to me. Your parents have a history of this kind of behavior, he told me during our final interview. I found records going back 15 years showing patterns of financial manipulation involving other family members, former business partners, and even elderly clients of your father's auto repair shop. Other victims? At least 6 that I can document. Your uncle Roberto, who lost his business when your parents convinced him to co-sign loans they never intended to repay. An elderly woman named Mrs. Chen, who hired your father to repair her car and ended up having her bank accounts drained through forged checks. 2 former employees who were convinced to take out personal loans to help with shop expenses and were never repaid. So this isn't just about me and the inheritance? This appears to be a long-term pattern of financial predation. Your grandmother's inheritance was just the largest target they'd ever attempted to secure. The article titled "The Family: Predators, a Pattern of Financial Manipulation and Fraud" was published on a Sunday morning and immediately went viral. By Monday, my parents were facing inquiries from multiple law enforcement agencies, and several of their previous victims had come forward with additional evidence. But the most devastating revelation came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Patterson called me Tuesday morning with news that changed everything. "Jessica, I've been contacted by a representative of your grandmother's estate planning attorney, the one who originally wrote her will. He has information that he thinks you need to hear." "What kind of information?" "It seems your grandmother anticipated exactly this scenario. She left detailed instructions with her attorney about what to do if your parents attempted to challenge the will or attack you personally." "What kind of instructions?" "Instructions to release additional documentation that she felt would be necessary to protect you if your parents escalated their harassment to the level of public accusations or legal threats." An hour later, I was sitting in the office of Robert Martinez, the attorney who had worked with my grandmother for over 20 years. He was an older man with kind eyes and a gentle manner that reminded me of Grandma Rosa herself. "Your grandmother was a remarkable woman," he said, pulling out a thick sealed envelope with my name on it. "She understood people very well, and she knew her son better than he knew himself." "What's in the envelope?" "Documentation that she felt would be necessary if your parents ever attempted to claim that she was mentally incompetent, or that you had manipulated her into changing." "Her will." Inside the envelope were medical records spanning the last 5 years of my grandmother's life, showing regular cognitive testing that consistently demonstrated her mental clarity. There were also audio recordings of her meetings with Mr. Martinez, where she explicitly discussed her concerns about her son's financial irresponsibility and her determination to protect her granddaughter's future. But the most powerful document was a detailed letter she'd written just 6 months before her death, after witnessing my parents' reaction to my college graduation and their obvious expectation that I would move back home and help support them financially. "I have watched my son and daughter-in-law for years," the letter read, "and I have seen how they view relationships as transactions and family as a source of financial support rather than emotional connection. I know that when I die, they will view my assets as their right rather than my choice. I know they will pressure Jessica to give up her inheritance, and when she refuses, they will escalate to more serious forms of manipulation and possibly illegal behavior." The letter went on to detail specific predictions about how my parents would likely behave, including attempts to manipulate other family members, potential document forgery, and even the possibility that they would make false accusations about my character or mental state. "She knew," I said, holding the letter with trembling hands. "She knew exactly what they would do." "She also left instructions for dealing with it," Mr. Martinez said, pulling out another document, "including authorization for me to testify on your behalf about her mental state, her intentions, and her explicit wishes regarding how her estate should be handled if challenged." "Why didn't you come forward sooner?" "Because she instructed me to wait until your parents had committed to their course of action publicly. She wanted them to fully expose themselves before providing you with the tools to defend against their attacks." "She was setting a trap?" She was protecting you in the most comprehensive way possible. Your grandmother understood that sometimes you have to let people reveal their true nature before you can effectively deal with them. That afternoon, Mrs. Patterson filed a motion to dismiss all charges against me, supported by Mr. Martinez's testimony and the documentation from my grandmother's sealed envelope. The motion included a request for sanctions against my parents and their attorney for filing frivolous claims based on fraudulent evidence. But my parents weren't finished. That evening, as Tyler and I were reviewing the day's developments, Brandon called with urgent news. "They're planning to leave town," he said. "I heard them talking about liquidating everything and moving to Mexico. Mom was saying something about how they can't stay in Phoenix now that everyone knows the truth." "Are they planning to take you with them?" "They want me to, but I told them I'm staying here to finish school. That's when things got really ugly." "What do you mean?" "Dad started screaming about how you'd turned me against the family, and Mom said I was making a choice that I'd regret for the rest of my life. Then they told me that if I stayed in Phoenix, I was dead to them." "Brandon, I'm sorry they're putting you through this." "I'm not sorry. I'm finally seeing them clearly, for the first time in my life. But Jessica, I think you need to be careful. When Dad gets this angry, he doesn't make rational decisions." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that if they're planning to leave town anyway, they might decide they have nothing left to lose. And when people have nothing left to lose, they sometimes do desperate things." After Brandon hung up, Tyler and I discussed whether we should be concerned about our physical safety. It seemed extreme, but given everything my parents had already done, it didn't seem impossible that they might escalate to more direct forms of intimidation. We decided to stay with friends for a few days while the legal proceedings concluded, just to be safe. It was a wise decision. 2 days later, Mrs. Patterson called with news that our caution had been justified. "Your parents attempted to break into your apartment last night," she said. "The building's security cameras caught them trying to pick the lock on your door around midnight." "What were they looking for?" "We can only speculate, but given their pattern of behavior, they were probably hoping to find documents they could destroy or steal, or perhaps plant evidence that would support their false accusations." "Did they get arrested?" "They were arrested for attempted breaking and entering, but they posted bail this morning. However, the arrest triggered a review of their travel documents, and immigration discovered that they've been making preparations to flee the country." "So they can't leave now?" "Their passports have been flagged, and they're not allowed to leave Arizona pending resolution of the criminal charges against them." The trap my grandmother had set 20 years in the future was finally closing. My parents had been so determined to destroy my independence that they'd exposed themselves as the predators they'd always been. And now they were facing the consequences of decades of manipulation and fraud. But even trapped and facing criminal charges, they had one final card to play. That evening, I received a call from an unknown number. When I answered, my mother's voice was barely controlled rage. "This isn't over, Jessica," she said. "You think you've won, but you have no idea what we're capable of." "Mom, it's time to stop. You've already destroyed your own lives. Don't make it worse." "We didn't destroy our lives. You did. You and that manipulative old woman who turned you against your own family. Grandma Rosa was the only one who truly loved me without conditions. She filled your head with poison about independence and self-reliance, and look where it's gotten you. Alone, friendless, and hated by your own family." "I'm not alone, and I'm not friendless. I have people who love me for who I am, not for what I can give them. We'll see how long that lasts when the truth comes out about what you really are." "The truth is already out, Mom. Everyone knows what you've done, and everyone can see who you really are." There was a long pause, and when she spoke again, her voice was cold and calculating. "You haven't won yet, Jessica. We still have options you haven't thought of." The line went dead, leaving me with the chilling certainty that the final confrontation was still to come. The final confrontation came 3 weeks later, in the most public way possible. My parents had requested a meeting with all parties present, claiming they had new evidence that would exonerate them and expose me as the real fraud. Mrs. Patterson was skeptical, but she agreed to the meeting on the condition that it take place in the courthouse conference room with court reporters present to document everything said. I arrived at the courthouse that Tuesday morning feeling strangely calm. Tyler walked beside me, holding my hand, while Mrs. Patterson carried 2 briefcases, full of evidence. We'd spent the previous evening going over every possible scenario, every lie my parents might attempt, every piece of documentation that proved their fraud. Brandon was already waiting in the conference room when we arrived, looking nervous, but determined. He'd chosen to testify against our parents despite their threats, and I knew how difficult that decision had been for him. "They're not here yet," he said quietly. But their attorney called this morning and said they'd be bringing additional counsel and new evidence that would change everything. Mrs. Patterson looked concerned. "Did he say what kind of evidence?" "Something about federal documentation and witness testimony that would prove you manipulated Grandma Rosa using illegal means." "That's impossible," I said. "There's no evidence of that because it never happened." "I know that, and you know that, but they seem convinced they have something that will turn this whole case around." 20 minutes later, my parents arrived. With not 1 but 3 attorneys, including a federal prosecutor who introduced herself as Assistant U.S. Attorney Sarah Mitchell. My heart sank as I realized they'd somehow convinced federal authorities to get involved in their case. "Ms. Torres," the federal prosecutor said as everyone took their seats, "I need to inform you that you're now under federal investigation for conspiracy to commit mail fraud, wire fraud, and potential elder abuse in connection with your grandmother's estate." I felt the blood drain from my face. "That's impossible. I've never committed any federal crimes. According to evidence provided by your parents, you orchestrated a sophisticated scheme to manipulate your elderly grandmother into changing her will while she was mentally incompetent, and you used interstate communications and financial transfers to execute this fraud." Mrs. Patterson leaned forward. "Ms. Mitchell, what evidence are you referring to? We've already demonstrated that the medical records claiming Mrs. Rosa Torres was mentally incompetent were forged." "We have new evidence," my father said, speaking for the first time. His voice was cold and confident, completely different from the desperate man I'd spoken to on the phone weeks earlier. "Evidence that shows Jessica's manipulation went much deeper than anyone realized." My mother opened a briefcase and pulled out a stack of documents. "We've been investigating our mother's final months, and we discovered that Jessica was systematically isolating her from the family while convincing her to change her will." "What are you talking about?" I asked. "Phone records," Mom said, sliding papers across the table, "showing hundreds of calls between you and your grandmother in the months before she died, including calls made at times when you claimed to be in class or at work." I looked at the phone records, feeling confused. "Of course I called Grandma frequently. We were close. There's nothing suspicious about that." "There is, when you combine it with this," Dad said, producing another document. "Bank records showing that your grandmother was making unusual financial transactions during the same time period, transactions that coincide exactly with your phone calls to her." The federal prosecutor studied the documents. "The pattern suggests that Ms. Torres may have been instructing her grandmother to move money between accounts or make changes to her financial arrangements." "That's not what happened," I protested. "I never told Grandma how to handle her money." "Then, how do you explain this?" Mom pulled out what appeared to be a transcript of a phone conversation. "This is a recording of one of your calls to your grandmother, where you can clearly be heard telling her to change her will and exclude us from her inheritance." Mrs. Patterson took the transcript and read it carefully. Her expression remained neutral, but I could see her making notes as she reviewed the document. This transcript purports to be from a phone conversation between Jessica and her grandmother, she said finally. Can you provide the actual audio recording? The original recording was damaged, Dad said quickly, but we had it professionally transcribed before it was lost. How convenient, Mrs. Patterson said dryly. And who exactly made this recording? Our mother had a security system installed in her home during her final months, Mom explained. She was concerned about break-ins and wanted to monitor any unusual activity. The system recorded all phone conversations automatically. I felt a chill run down my spine. If there really was a recording of me talking to Grandma about her will, it could be taken out of context to support their claims. But something about their explanation didn't make sense. Mrs. Patterson, I said quietly, can I speak with you privately for a moment? The federal prosecutor nodded, and Mrs. Patterson and I stepped out of the conference room. Jessica, is there any possibility that you discussed your grandmother's will with her over the phone? Of course I did. She wanted to make sure I understood her wishes and that I was prepared to handle the inheritance responsibly. But I never told her what to do with her money. Is it possible that someone could have taken those conversations out of context to make it sound like you were manipulating her? Maybe, but there's something else. Grandma never had a security system installed in her house. She always said they were too expensive and complicated. Mrs. Patterson's eyes sharpened. Are you certain about that? Absolutely certain. I was at her house almost every week during her final months, and there was never any security system. Then, either your parents are lying about where this recording came from, or they fabricated it entirely. We returned to the conference room, where my parents and their attorneys were huddled in conversation. The federal prosecutor looked impatient, clearly wanting to move forward with whatever evidence they'd presented. Ms. Mitchell, Mrs. Patterson said, we have some concerns about the authenticity of this alleged phone recording. What kind of concerns? My client states that her grandmother never had a security system installed in her home, which contradicts the explanation for how this recording was obtained. Mom's face flushed red. Of course she had a security system. We helped her install it ourselves. Then you should have installation records, monitoring service contracts, and equipment serial numbers, Mrs. Patterson said. Can you provide those? The room fell silent as my parents exchanged glances with their attorneys. The installation was done privately, Dad said finally, by a friend of ours who works in security. There wouldn't be formal contracts. But there would be equipment, Mrs. Patterson pressed. Where is the recording device that captured this conversation? It was damaged in a break-in at our mother's house after she died, Mom said quickly. How convenient that all the physical evidence has been destroyed or damaged, Mrs. Patterson observed. Ms. Mitchell, I'd like to request that this alleged transcript be subjected to forensic analysis before we proceed any further. The federal prosecutor looked skeptical. Mr. and Mrs. Torres, do you have any other evidence supporting your claims? My parents huddled with their attorneys again, whispering urgently. Finally, their lead attorney spoke up. We have witness testimony from neighbors who observed Jessica visiting her grandmother frequently during the final months, often carrying documents and staying for hours at a time. Visiting my grandmother frequently doesn't prove fraud, I said. I loved her and I spent time with her because she was dying. But the documents you were carrying, Mom insisted, were legal papers related to her will and estate planning. How would the neighbors know what documents I was carrying? Mrs. Patterson asked. Because, Dad said triumphantly, one of them is a retired paralegal who recognized estate planning documents when she saw them. Brandon, who had been silent throughout the exchange, suddenly spoke up. Which neighbor? Mrs. Rodriguez, from across the street, Mom said. Mrs. Rodriguez has been legally blind for 5 years, Brandon said quietly. She couldn't recognize documents from across the street even if she wanted to. The silence that followed was deafening. My parents had just been caught in another, obvious lie, and even their attorneys looked uncomfortable. The federal prosecutor closed her folder and stood up. "Mr. and Mrs. Torres, I'm withdrawing federal involvement in this case. The evidence you've provided appears to be unreliable at best and potentially fabricated. I suggest you focus on resolving this matter in civil court." As she left the room, my parents' facade of confidence finally cracked. Mom started crying, and Dad began shouting about how the system was rigged against them and how everyone was conspiring to protect me. "This isn't over," he yelled as their attorneys tried to calm him down. "We know what you did, Jessica, and we'll prove it, even if it takes the rest of our lives." "Actually," Mrs. Patterson said calmly, "it is over. The criminal charges against Jessica have been dropped. The civil lawsuit has been dismissed with prejudice, and your own criminal charges for fraud and document forgery are still pending." "We're appealing everything," Mom said through her tears. "With what money?" Mrs. Patterson asked. "Your assets have been frozen pending restitution to your previous victims, and no reputable attorney will take your case without payment up front." It was true. The investigation triggered by the Arizona Republic article had uncovered so many instances of financial fraud that my parents were facing multiple lawsuits and criminal charges. The auto repair shop had been seized by creditors, and their house was in foreclosure. As we left the courthouse that day, I felt a strange mix of sadness and relief. The war was finally over, but the victory felt hollow. I'd won the right to keep my inheritance and build my life as I chose, but I'd lost my parents in the process. "Do you think they'll ever admit they were wrong?" Tyler asked as we walked to our car. "No," I said sadly. "I think they genuinely believe they were the victims in this situation. They can't accept that their own choices led to their downfall." Brandon caught up with us in the parking lot. "Jessica, I want you to know that I'm proud of you for fighting back. Grandma Rosa would be proud too." "What will you do now?" I asked him. "Finish school. Probably change my major to focus on helping families deal with financial abuse. Someone needs to help people recognize these patterns before they get as bad as ours did." "That sounds like something Grandma would approve of." 3 months later, Tyler and I were married in a small ceremony in Sedona, surrounded by the friends who had supported us through the worst of the crisis. Rachel had come back into my life after my parents' defeat, apologizing for abandoning me when I needed her most. I forgave her because I understood the pressure they'd put her under. My business had not only survived the attack, but had actually grown stronger. The media attention had brought my story to thousands of people dealing with similar family financial manipulation, and Desert Wings Consulting was now helping clients across the country establish independence from financially abusive relatives. The inheritance money had grown substantially through careful investment, and I'd used part of it to establish the Rosa Torres Foundation, providing legal aid and financial counseling to young adults dealing with family financial abuse. It seemed like the perfect way to honor Grandma's memory and extend her protection to future generations. My parents had disappeared from Phoenix after losing their final appeal. Brandon heard from mutual acquaintances that they'd moved to a small town in New Mexico, where they were trying to rebuild their lives under assumed names. They'd never contacted me directly again, though Brandon occasionally received bitter messages blaming him for choosing me over family loyalty. "Do you ever regret fighting back so hard?" Tyler asked me one evening as we sat on the patio of our new house, watching the sunset over the Phoenix mountains. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd just given them the money from the beginning," I admitted. "Maybe we could have found a way to be a family." "Do you really believe that?" I thought about it carefully. "No, I don't. They would have spent the money and then come back for more. The inheritance was never really about the money. It was about control, and they would never have been satisfied with anything less than complete dominance over my life. Your grandmother knew that. She did. She understood them better than I did, and she gave me the tools to protect myself even when I didn't realize I'd need them. 6 months after the wedding, I received an unexpected phone call. It was from a lawyer in New Mexico, informing me that my parents had been arrested again, this time for attempting to defraud an elderly man out of his life savings using forged documents and false identities. They used the same tactics they tried on you, the lawyer explained, claiming to be relatives of the deceased wife, producing fake medical records, and trying to convince him that his will needed to be changed for tax purposes. So it really was a pattern, not just desperation over our family situation. It appears to be their standard method of operation. The gentleman they targeted came forward after seeing news coverage of your case. He recognized the tactics and realized he was being manipulated. The news should have made me feel vindicated, but instead, it just made me sad. My parents had learned nothing from their defeat. They were still trying to steal from vulnerable people, still convinced that they were entitled to other people's money. They were sentenced to federal prison for elder fraud, and this time there would be no appeals, no manipulated evidence, and no escape. The pattern of financial predation that had defined their adult lives was finally over. Brandon graduated from ASU with a degree in social work and immediately enrolled in a master's program specializing in family therapy and financial abuse prevention. He'd found his calling in helping other families avoid the destructive patterns that had torn ours apart. I've been thinking about visiting them in prison, he told me during one of our monthly coffee meetings. Do you think that's a good idea? Probably not, but I feel like I should try one more time to help them understand what they did wrong. Maybe if they could acknowledge the harm they caused, they could start to heal. And if they can't? Then at least I'll know I tried. But Jessica, I want you to know that whatever they say or do, it doesn't change the fact that you were right to fight back. You saved both of us from becoming like them. A year later, Brandon did visit our parents in prison. He came back sad, but not surprised by their reaction. They spent the entire visit trying to convince me that you'd brainwashed me against them, he reported. They still believe they're the victims, that everyone conspired against them, that they never did anything wrong. I'm sorry, Brandon. Don't be. It confirmed what I already knew, that they're incapable of taking responsibility for their choices. But it also confirmed something else. What's that? That we broke the cycle, whatever dysfunction they inherited from their own families, whatever drove them to manipulate and steal from the people who loved them, it stops with us. He was right. The Rosa Torres Foundation was now helping hundreds of families establish healthy financial boundaries and break cycles of manipulation that sometimes went back generations. The inheritance that my parents had tried so hard to steal was being used to help other people escape exactly the kind of toxic family dynamics that had defined my childhood. Tyler and I welcomed our first child, a daughter we named Rosa, on the 2nd anniversary of my grandmother's death. As I held her in the hospital room, surrounded by the chosen family of friends and allies who had supported us through our darkest times, I thought about the letter Grandma had left me. Sometimes, mija, you have to weather the storm to prove that your roots go deep enough to survive anything. I had weathered the storm. More than that, I had learned to dance in the rain, to find strength in adversity, and to build something beautiful from the ashes of a broken family system. The inheritance had never really been about money. It had been about freedom, independence, and the right to choose my own path without manipulation or coercion. Grandma Rosa had given me more than financial security. She'd given me the courage to stand up for myself and the wisdom to help others do the same. As I looked at my daughter sleeping peacefully in my arms, I made a silent promise. She would grow up knowing that love doesn't come with conditions, that family means support rather than manipulation, and that independence is not something to fear, but something to celebrate. The cycle of financial abuse that had defined my parents' relationship with money and family was broken. In its place, Tyler and I would build something new, something healthy, something that honored the legacy of a woman who had understood that the greatest gift you can give someone is the tools to stand on their own 2 feet. My parents had thrown me out on my 22nd birthday for refusing to sacrifice my future to fix their mistakes. They'd tried to destroy my business, my relationships, and my reputation when their manipulation failed. But in the end, all they'd accomplished was proving that Grandma Rosa had been right about everything. The inheritance hadn't just bought me financial independence. It had bought me the freedom to become the person I was meant to be, unencumbered by the toxic expectations and manipulative demands of people who confused love with control. Standing in that hospital room, holding my daughter, and surrounded by people who truly loved me, I realized that this was what victory looked like. Not the defeat of my enemies, but the creation of something beautiful and healthy from the ruins they'd left behind. Grandma Rosa's voice seemed to whisper in my ear one final time, "Mija, you learned to fly. Now teach your daughter that she was born with wings." Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.